The rain hadn't let up for hours, turning the dirt road leading to my cabin into a river of mud. Thunder rolled in the distance, a low growl that matched my mood. Nights like these usually brought a kind of comfort, the kind you find in solitude and a roaring fireplace. But tonight, something felt off. I leaned back in my creaky armchair, book in hand, though the words on the page blurred into the background noise of the storm. The fire crackled softly, the only light in the otherwise shadowed room. My cabin was simple, wood-paneled walls lined with shelves of well-worn books, a small kitchen tucked into the corner, and a window with a view of the endless forest that surrounded me. I had chosen this life deliberately, far from the complications of people. People had a way of disappointing you. Then came the sound, a faint rhythmic thumping against the door, almost drowned out by the rain. I froze. Out here, miles from the nearest town, no one ever knocked on my door. The locals knew I valued my privacy, and I didn't exactly have a welcome mat out for uninvited guests. My pulse quickened as I stood and grabbed the flashlight from the table. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. When I swung open the door, my breath caught. Standing there, or rather slumping there, was a woman unlike anyone I'd ever seen. She was tall, her frame slight, but elegant, with skin that seemed to shimmer faintly even in the dim light. Her hair clung to her face in wet strands, but its color was impossible to pin down, shifting between shades of silver and deep violet as the rain ran through it. Her eyes, though, were what struck me most, large and luminous like they held entire galaxies within them. "Help," she murmured, her voice soft and melodic but tinged with exhaustion. Without thinking, I reached out to steady her as she swayed on her feet. Her hand was cool to the touch, and her grip, though weak, had an odd precision to it, as if she were calculating the exact amount of pressure needed to balance herself. "Inside," I said, half commanding, half pleading as I pulled her into the cabin. Once inside, she collapsed onto the couch, her shimmering form looking entirely out of place in my worn, earthy home. I grabbed a blanket and draped it over her. "You're not from around here," I said, a weak attempt at humor to mask my unease. Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Number not. From here." "Well, that clears it up," I muttered under my breath. As I fumbled to start the fire again, I couldn't help sneaking glances at her. She seemed both otherworldly and deeply vulnerable, her breathing shallow and her fingers twitching as if in restless thought. When the fire roared to life, she blinked, her eyes reflecting the flames like polished glass. "Thank you," she said softly. I cleared my throat. "You're welcome. Do you, have a name?" "Lyrian," she said, pronouncing it slowly, as though translating it into a language unfamiliar to her. "Okay, Lyrian, I'm Ethan." I hesitated, then added, "You look like you've been through a lot. Can you tell me what happened?" She tilted her head, considering me in a way that made me feel uncomfortably small. "I cannot explain everything, not yet, but my transport failed. I am stranded." "Transport?" I asked, my brow furrowing. Her gaze dropped to the floor. "My craft, damaged. I am not from this world." The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. Part of me wanted to laugh, to dismiss it as the ramblings of a delirious woman, but the logical part of my brain couldn't ignore the evidence staring me in the face. Her appearance, her voice, the way her very presence felt different, like she operated on a wavelength just slightly removed from my own. "Well," I said after a long pause, "that would explain why you don't look like someone who's lost in the woods." To my surprise, she laughed, a quiet, almost musical sound. "You are amusing." "Yeah, people say that all the time," I deadpanned. Her smile faded quickly, replaced by a look of concern. "Your world is very wet." "It's called rain," I said, sitting down across from her. "You don't have it where you're from?" "Not like this," she replied. "Water is contained, controlled. Here, it falls from the sky without purpose." She paused, glancing at the window where the rain continued to lash against the glass. It is chaotic. Beautiful. I watched her for a moment, unsure how to respond. She seemed so out of place, yet there was something undeniably human about the way she spoke, the way her fingers curled into the blanket as if searching for warmth. "Do you need food? Water?" I asked. Her eyes lit up briefly. "Water. Yes. I must replenish." I fetched a glass from the kitchen, half expecting her to drink it in some bizarre alien way. Instead, she sipped it like any ordinary person, though her expression turned thoughtful as she did. "Your water tastes raw," she said. "It's filtered," I replied, unsure if that was a compliment or a complaint. "Filtered," she repeated, rolling the word around like it was foreign to her. "Interesting." As the night wore on, her breathing grew steadier, and her otherworldly glow dimmed slightly, as if she were adapting to her surroundings. Meanwhile, my mind raced with questions I didn't dare ask yet. Who was she, really? Why had she come here? And what was I supposed to do now? Before I could dwell too much, Lyrian spoke again, her voice softer now. "Thank you, Ethan, for your kindness." I shrugged, unsure how to respond. "Well, it's not every day an alien shows up on my doorstep. Figured I'd at least hear you out before calling the authorities." Her lips curved into that faint smile again. "Authorities would not understand." "Yeah, probably not," I muttered, leaning back in my chair. As the storm raged on outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far stranger than I was prepared for. And yet, for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. Morning arrived, and with it, a strange sense of normalcy. The rain had dwindled to a faint drizzle, the light filtering through the clouds in pale, uneven streaks. I woke to the faint hum of activity in the cabin, which immediately set my nerves on edge. I lived alone. Nothing should have been making noise. When I padded into the main room, I found Lyrian crouched by the table, her long fingers delicately holding my coffee maker. She turned it over, studying it with the intensity of someone examining an alien artifact. "Good morning?" I ventured cautiously. She glanced up, her eyes catching the faint sunlight and shifting colors in a way that made me blink. "Ethan," she said, her voice serene, "your liquid brewing device is suboptimal." I frowned. "It's a coffee maker. It works fine." "Fine is not optimal," she replied matter-of-factly, setting it down with an air of mild disappointment. "It could be better." "Well, I like my suboptimal coffee," I muttered, reaching for it. But before I could start brewing, Lyrian tilted her head, studying me with that unnerving precision again. "Your sleep was inefficient," she said, her tone entirely serious. "Excuse me?" "You were restless," she elaborated. "I could hear you from the couch. You muttered something about losing another wrench." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "It's not every day an alien crashes into my life, you know. It's been a lot to process." Her expression softened slightly, though her next words caught me off guard. "I can ensure more efficient rest for you if necessary. I am capable of—" "Let's just stick to coffee, okay?" I interrupted, holding up a hand. She blinked, looking faintly puzzled. "As you wish." By the time the coffee was ready, Lyrian had settled herself cross-legged on the floor, her shimmering hair draped over her shoulders. She was holding a spoon, inspecting it as though it held the secrets of the universe. "This is an excellent design," she said, her tone reverent. "It's a spoon," I said, trying not to laugh. "Yes, it is simple yet highly functional," she replied, tracing its curved edge. "On my world, we have nothing comparable." "What, no spoons?" I asked, genuinely curious now. She shook her head. "Our sustenance is absorbed differently. Utensils are unnecessary." "Well," I said, pouring myself a cup of coffee, "welcome to Earth, land of spoons and suboptimal coffee makers." Her lips quirked into a faint smile, and for a moment, The tension of the past night seemed to dissipate. The day unfolded in a way I could only describe as surreal. Lyrian insisted on helping with various tasks around the cabin, though her definition of help was unique. When I mentioned needing to repair the kitchen sink, a task I'd been putting off for weeks, she perked up immediately. "I can assist," she said confidently. "Do you even know what a sink is?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "I have observed its function. Water enters, water exits, a containment system." "Right," I said, handing her a wrench with some trepidation. For the next hour, I watched as Lyrian worked with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. At one point, she muttered something under her breath, her language slipping into a series of melodic, unfamiliar tones. "Is that your native language?" I asked, leaning against the doorway. "Yes," she said without looking up. "It is more efficient for thought processes." "Well, it sounds like you're casting spells on my plumbing," I said dryly. Her head tilted at the remark, a flicker of amusement crossing her face. "If your plumbing improves, would it matter?" "Touché." When she finally finished, she stood back with an air of triumph. The sink now sported a faintly glowing seam of silvery material that hadn't been there before. "What did you do?" I asked, both impressed and mildly alarmed. "I reinforced it with a biometal compound from my reserves," she explained. "It will self-repair if damaged." "Self-repairing plumbing," I repeated, staring at the sink. "That's definitely not from the hardware store." Her expression shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. Pride, maybe? It was hard to tell. "You're welcome," she said, her tone neutral, but with a hint of satisfaction. As the day wore on, I began to notice how Lyrian interacted with the world around her. She was endlessly curious, her movements precise but filled with a kind of wonder that was almost childlike. When I took her outside to show her the woods, she studied the trees as though memorizing every leaf, her fingers brushing against the bark. "This place," she said softly, "is chaotic, but beautiful." I couldn't argue with that. The forest had always been my sanctuary, even before I retreated from the world. Seeing it through her eyes, though, made it feel new somehow. She paused at a patch of moss, crouching to examine it closely. "This is alive," she said, her tone filled with awe. "Moss," I said. "It's not that exciting." "It thrives despite its simplicity," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "That is remarkable." Her perspective was fascinating, even if it occasionally left me feeling like the oblivious one. And that evening, as we sat by the fire, I finally broached the question that had been nagging at me all day. "So, how long do you plan to stay?" Lyrian looked up from the small, intricate device she'd been tinkering with, something she'd pulled from her pack, its surface covered in faintly glowing symbols. "I do not know," she admitted. "My transport requires significant repairs. It may take time." I nodded, though her words left me with a strange sense of unease. I told myself it was just the disruption of my routine, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. "Is it dangerous?" I asked. "You being here, I mean." She considered this for a moment. Not immediately, but prolonged exposure could attract attention. From who? Her gaze flicked to the window, her expression unreadable. Others who would not understand. Great. As if my life wasn't complicated enough. Still, as the fire crackled and Lyrian returned to her device, I felt a strange sense of calm. For all her otherworldly qualities, there was something grounding about her presence. "Ethan," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Yeah? Thank you for your kindness." Her words were simple, but the sincerity in her voice caught me off guard. "Don't mention it," I said gruffly, turning my attention to the fire. As the flames danced, I realized that for the first time in years, my cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a home. The hum of the forest had a calming rhythm to it, a blend of bird calls, rustling leaves, and the distant gurgle of a creek. Normally, this backdrop was all I needed to settle my nerves, but not today. Not with an alien sitting on my porch trying to calibrate some strange, glowing contraption while simultaneously scaring off every bird in a 100-yard radius. "What is that thing?" I asked, stepping out of the cabin with a mug of coffee in hand. Lyrian didn't look up. "A transponder." "Uh-huh," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "And what exactly does a transponder do?" "It transmits," she replied, her tone flat, though her fingers moved with a grace that belied the simplicity of her answer. I raised an eyebrow. "Transmits what? A distress signal? Coordinates? Recipes for alien stew?" She paused, her head tilting in that way she did when she found something particularly odd. "Recipes?" "Number data, primarily." "Figures," I muttered. "You aliens always go for the boring stuff." Her lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. It was the closest I'd seen her come to laughing. Satisfied that I'd at least cracked her stoic exterior, I plopped down in the chair beside her. The transponder was about the size of a shoebox, its surface etched with intricate patterns that glowed faintly. Every so often it emitted a soft chime, like a wind chime caught in a gentle breeze. "So, what's the plan?" I asked. "The plan?" "You know," I said, gesturing vaguely. "The get off this planet plan. Or is this transponder your version of calling roadside assistance?" Her gaze flicked to me, and for a moment I thought she was going to ignore the question. Instead, she set the device down gently and folded her hands in her lap. "The transponder is complex," she began. "It requires recalibration to function within your planet's electromagnetic parameters. Once complete, it may send a signal capable of reaching my people." "And then what? They come pick you up in a flying saucer?" Lyrian frowned slightly. "Our vessels are not saucer-shaped." "Of course they're not," I said, stifling a grin. Her gaze lingered on me, her expression unreadable. "Why do you respond to serious matters with humor?" I shrugged. "Because the alternative is freaking out and I'm trying to avoid that. Besides, you've got this whole mysterious alien thing going on. Somebody's got to keep it light." Her head tilted again, but this time there was a glimmer of something in her eyes. Curiosity, maybe. "Your species is resilient," she said finally. "Yeah, we're a scrappy bunch," I replied, taking a sip of coffee. As the morning wore on, I tried to make myself useful while Lyrian continued to tinker with her transponder. I chopped firewood, cleaned out the gutters, and even attempted to fix a rickety chair that had been on the verge of collapse for months. Through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced toward the porch, Lyrian's eyes were on me, observing with an intensity that made me self-conscious. "Something on your mind?" I asked after the third or fourth time. "You are different," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Different how?" "Your movements," she said, gesturing vaguely. "They lack efficiency, and yet you accomplish your tasks." "Thanks," I said, unsure if that was a compliment. "It is intriguing," she added, as though that clarified things. I decided not to press the matter. By midday, the transponder had begun to emit a faint, rhythmic pulse. Lyrian seemed pleased, though her version of pleased was a slight upward tilt of her mouth and a brief nod. "It is operational," she announced. "Great," I said. "Now what?" "Now we wait." "For how long?" She hesitated, her fingers brushing over the device. "It is uncertain. My people may receive the signal quickly, or it may take time." "Define time. Are we talking hours, days, years?" She glanced at me, and for the first time there was a flicker of unease in her expression. "It depends on their proximity, and their ability to decipher the signal." "Well, that's comforting," I muttered. The rest of the day passed in a strange mix of routine and anticipation. I showed Lyrian how to use the stove without setting anything on fire, a lesson that took longer than I'd expected, given her tendency to analyze every knob and button as though they held the secrets of the universe. "Your heating mechanism is archaic," she said, watching the flames flicker beneath the pan. "It's a gas stove," I replied. "What were you expecting, nuclear fusion?" Her silence was answer enough. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself sitting on the porch again, the transponder humming softly beside me. Lyrian stood nearby, her gaze fixed on the stars. "You miss it, don't you?" I asked. She didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "It is not easy to be displaced." I nodded, staring into my coffee. "I get that." Her head turned slightly, her luminous eyes catching the faint glow of the transponder. "Do you? You seem at peace here." "Peaceful isn't the same as happy," I said, before I could stop myself. Her gaze lingered on me, and for a moment I thought she was going to press the issue. Instead, she turned back to the stars. As the night deepened, I found myself growing more comfortable in Lyrian's presence. Her alienness, while still unsettling at times, was tempered by her quiet curiosity and occasional flashes of dry humor. At one point, I caught her staring at a jar of pickles I'd left on the counter. "Do you eat?" I asked, gesturing to the jar. "Not as you do," she replied. "Care to elaborate?" She picked up the jar, turning it over in her hands. "My sustenance is derived from molecular energy absorption. Solid matter is inefficient." "Well, you're missing out," I said, popping a pickle into my mouth. "These are a delicacy." Her expression didn't change, but there was a faint glimmer of amusement in her eyes. "I will take your word for it." As I lay in bed that night, the soft hum of the transponder echoing faintly through the cabin, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of connection to Lyrian. She was still a mystery, her presence a disruption to the quiet life I'd built for myself. And yet, for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I wasn't eager for her to leave. The morning began in silence, the kind of quiet that settles after a storm. Lyrian was already outside when I emerged from the cabin, her figure framed by the faint mist curling between the trees. She stood as still as a statue, her gaze fixed on the sky. "See something up there?" I asked, stepping onto the porch. Her head turned slightly, just enough for me to catch the flicker of tension in her expression. "The signal is faint," she said. "I am attempting to discern its response pattern." I nodded, even though I didn't entirely understand what she meant. "Any luck?" "None yet." "Well," I said, leaning on the porch railing, "at least it's not raining." Her lips quirked, just a hint. Small comforts. After breakfast, a strange affair that involved me trying to explain the concept of pancakes to someone who didn't eat solid food, we fell into a routine of sorts. Lyrian alternated between monitoring her transponder and wandering the woods, her fascination with Earth's flora and fauna growing by the hour. "Your world is vibrant," she said at one point, crouching to examine a cluster of wildflowers. "Chaotic but vibrant." "Chaotic is a polite way of putting it," I muttered, swatting at a mosquito. "Welcome to Earth, home of mosquitoes, traffic jams, and bad coffee." She tilted her head. "Mosquitoes are efficient predators." "Yeah, well, they're also annoying," I replied, smacking another one. Her gaze lingered on me, her expression almost amused. "Your species complains often." "It's part of our charm," I said with a grin. And by midday, the tension that had been simmering since Lyrian's arrival took an unexpected turn. I was chopping firewood when a faint metallic whirring sound caught my attention. It wasn't the wind, and it definitely wasn't anything natural. "Lyrian?" I called, setting the axe down. She appeared almost instantly, her movements so fluid it was like she'd materialized out of the shadows. "You heard it too," she said, her voice calm but laced with urgency. "What is it?" Her gaze swept the tree line, her eyes narrowing. Unfamiliar technology. Close. My stomach tightened. Unfamiliar how? She didn't answer, instead pulling a small device from her belt. It looked like a compact scanner, its surface glowing faintly as she turned it on. The whirring grew louder, and then, without warning, something emerged from the woods. A sleek, insect-like drone, its body shimmering with a metallic sheen. It hovered a few feet off the ground, its single glowing eye swiveling to face us. "Friend of yours?" I asked, my voice edged with nervous humor. Lyrian's expression hardened. "No." Before I could process her response, the drone emitted a high-pitched chirp, followed by a beam of light that scanned the area. Lyrian moved quickly, pulling me behind her as she raised her scanner. "Stay back," she said, her tone sharp. "Wasn't planning on going near it," I muttered, peeking out from behind her. Lyrian pressed a button on her device, and a faint, pulsing wave of energy rippled outward. The drone shuddered, its movements becoming erratic before it veered sharply to the left and disappeared into the woods. "What just happened?" I asked, stepping out from behind her. "I disrupted its signal," she said, lowering her scanner. "Disrupted? You mean you broke it?" "Temporarily." "Great," I said, running a hand through my hair. "So now what? Are there more of those things out there?" "Possibly." "Possibly?" I repeated, my voice rising. "That's not exactly reassuring, Lyrian." Her gaze softened slightly, though her tone remained steady. "It is unlikely they will return immediately, but we should prepare." The rest of the day was spent fortifying the cabin, though I wasn't entirely sure how much good it would do against alien technology. Lyrian's approach was methodical, her knowledge of energy fields and structural weaknesses far beyond anything I could comprehend. At one point she paused, looking at me with something akin to concern. "You are uneasy," she said. "No kidding," I replied, hammering a board into place. "I didn't exactly sign up for alien drones in my backyard." Her expression shifted, a faint crease forming between her brows. "You blame me for this." I sighed, setting the hammer down. "I don't blame you, Lyrian. But you showing up kind of changed things, you know." She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I did not intend to disrupt your life." "Yeah, well," I said, offering a faint smile. "Life's full of disruptions. You're just a little more unique than most." Her lips twitched again, that almost smile I was starting to recognize. As night fell, the forest seemed to grow quieter, the usual hum of crickets and rustling leaves replaced by an eerie stillness. Lyrian's transponder pulsed softly on the porch, its rhythmic glow the only light besides the stars. "Do you think they'll come back?" I asked, breaking the silence. "They may," she said, her voice calm. "Do you ever give straight answers?" Her head tilted, and for a moment I thought she might laugh. "Rarely." We sat in silence for a while, the tension between us tempered by the faint crackle of the fire I'd built in the cabin's small hearth. Despite everything, the drones, the uncertainty of Lyrian's presence, I felt a strange sense of companionship. "You know," I said, staring into the flames, "for someone who doesn't eat or sleep like a human, you're surprisingly relatable." "Relatable?" she repeated, her tone curious. "Yeah, you're curious, you're resourceful, and you've got this dry sense of humor that sneaks up on you." Her gaze lingered on me, and for the first time, I saw something warm in her expression. "You are unique as well, Ethan." "Unique how?" She hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "You adapt to uncertainty with grace and humor." "Not sure if grace is the right word," I said, chuckling. "But thanks, I guess." Her lips curved into that faint smile again, and for a moment, the weight of the day lifted. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the faint hum of the transponder and the occasional rustle of the trees, I couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. For better or worse, my life was no longer just mine. And despite the uncertainty, I realized that part of me didn't mind. Dawn arrived with an uneasy quiet, the kind of stillness that makes your skin prickle. I stepped onto the porch, the coffee in my hand growing cold as I scanned the woods for signs of movement. Nothing. Just the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze and the soft hum of Lyrian's transponder. She was already awake, of course. Did she ever sleep? Sitting cross-legged beside the device. Her focus was so intense that I almost didn't want to interrupt. Almost. "So," I began, leaning against the railing. "Any progress?" Lyrian glanced up, her expression unreadable. "The signal has been received." My stomach dropped. "Wait, received? As in, someone out there got it?" She nodded, her fingers brushing over the transponder's surface. "Yes, but the response is irregular." "Irregular how?" "Fragments," she said, her tone thoughtful. "Incomplete data. It suggests interference or an unfamiliar source." "Unfamiliar?" I asked, setting my mug down. "You mean it might not be your people?" She didn't answer right away, her gaze shifting to the tree line. "It is possible." The morning passed in a haze of nervous energy. Lyrian remained glued to her transponder, her focus unyielding as she attempted to decipher the fragmented signals. Meanwhile, I busied myself with small tasks, stacking firewood, cleaning the cabin windows, anything to keep my hands busy and my mind from spiraling. By midday, the tension in the air had become almost suffocating. Finally, I set down the broom I'd been wielding like a lifeline and walked back onto the porch. "You know," I said, crossing my arms, "if this whole alien communication thing doesn't work out, you could always get a job as a professional statue." Lyrian glanced up, her lips quirking into that faint, almost smile I'd come to recognize. "Your attempts at humor are persistent." "Yeah, well," I said, shrugging, "you're kind of a tough audience." Her gaze lingered on me for a moment before she returned her attention to the transponder. "The interference is deliberate." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Deliberate? You're saying someone's blocking the signal? Or attempting to manipulate it?" she said, her tone calm but edged with tension. I swallowed hard. "And we don't know who." "No." "Well," I said, forcing a grin, "this just keeps getting better and better." That afternoon, the whirring sound returned. Faint at first, like the distant hum of a machine, but growing louder with each passing second. Lyrian was on her feet instantly, her scanner in hand. "Stay here," she said, her voice sharp. "Yeah, not happening," I replied, grabbing a flashlight, because, of course, I didn't have anything more useful. We stepped into the woods together, the sound growing louder as we moved deeper into the trees. The sunlight filtering through the canopy cast strange, shifting patterns on the ground, making the shadows seem alive. And then we saw it. Another drone, larger than the first, its metallic surface gleaming in the dappled light. It hovered just above the ground, its movements unnervingly smooth. Lyrian raised her scanner, but before she could activate it, the drone emitted a piercing, high-pitched whine. The sound was disorienting, like nails on a chalkboard amplified 100-fold. I clapped my hands over my ears, stumbling backward. "Lyrian!" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the noise. She didn't respond, her focus locked on the drone. Her fingers moved quickly over the scanner, and after a few tense seconds, the whine cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. "Are you okay?" I asked, lowering my hands. "I am unharmed," she said, her voice steady. But the drone was not autonomous. I frowned. "Not... what now?" "Controlled remotely," she explained, her gaze sweeping the area. "Someone is watching." The rest of the day was a blur of preparation. Lyrian insisted on reinforcing the cabin's defenses, though her methods were far beyond anything I could comprehend. At one point, she attached a small glowing device to the front door, explaining that it would emit a localized electromagnetic disruption field. "Translation?" I asked, watching as she adjusted the settings. "It will deter further intrusions," she said simply. "Well, here's hoping it works," I muttered. Despite the tension, there were moments of levity. At one point, while setting up another device near the edge of the woods, Lyrian paused to examine a squirrel that had wandered too close. "Your planet's creatures are unusual," she said, watching as the squirrel darted up a tree. "Unusual how?" "They are both cautious and reckless," she said, tilting her head. "It is paradoxical." I chuckled. "Yeah, that sounds about right." As night fell, the transponder emitted a series of faint, rhythmic pulses. Lyrian's expression was unreadable as she studied the patterns, her focus unyielding. "Anything new?" I asked, sitting down beside her. "The signal is stabilizing," she said, "but the interference remains." I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. "So what do we do? Just sit here and wait for whoever's messing with it to show up?" "Patience is required," she said, her tone calm. "Patience isn't exactly my strong suit," I admitted. Her lips quirked into that faint, almost smile again. "I have noticed." We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the faint hum of the transponder. Despite everything, the drones, the interference, the looming sense of danger, I felt oddly at ease. "You know," I said, staring up at the stars, "for all the chaos you've brought into my life, it's been interesting having you around." Her gaze flicked to me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something warm in her expression. "You are adaptable," she said. "Is that your way of saying I'm growing on you?" Her lips curved slightly. "Perhaps." As I lay in bed that night, listening to the faint rustle of the trees and the hum of the transponder, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of fear and anticipation. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, I had a feeling we weren't done with them yet. The morning arrived with a fragile calm, like the hush before a storm. A heavy mist clung to the forest, muffling sounds and blurring the lines between earth and sky. I stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, and found Lyrian already at work. She was crouched near her transponder, her expression more focused than usual, the faint pulses of light emanating from the device reflected in her eyes, giving her an otherworldly glow. "Busy morning?" I asked, setting my mug down on the railing. She didn't look up. "The signal has shifted. Its source is no longer stationary." I frowned. "What does that mean? Is it moving closer?" "Unclear," she replied, "but the pattern suggests intentional redirection." "Redirection?" I echoed, feeling a familiar knot of unease tighten in my chest. "So whoever's out there is playing games?" Her gaze flicked to me, her expression unreadable. "That is one interpretation." The day passed in a strange rhythm, alternating between tense preparation and moments of surreal normalcy. Lyrian continued to analyze the signal, her fingers moving deftly over the transponder's interface. Meanwhile, I busied myself with fortifying the cabin, though my contributions felt increasingly inadequate compared to her advanced methods. At one point, I caught her examining a small bird that had landed on the porch. She watched it with an intensity that bordered on reverence. "Are all your species so curious?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. Her gaze didn't waver from the bird. "Curiosity is a trait that ensures survival." I grinned. And here I thought it was just a way to kill time. The bird fluttered away and she turned to me, her lips curving into that faint, almost smile. "Your humor is persistent." "Hey, someone's got to keep things light around here," I said, spreading my arms. "We can't all be stoic alien geniuses." Her expression softened, and for a moment, the tension between us seemed to dissolve. Then the whirring sound returned in the late afternoon, louder and more insistent than before. This time it wasn't just one drone. 3 of them emerged from the woods, their metallic bodies glinting in the dappled sunlight. "Great," I muttered, grabbing the nearest thing that resembled a weapon, a rusty shovel leaning against the porch. Because one wasn't enough. Lyrian stepped in front of me, her scanner already in hand. "Stay behind me," she said, her tone firm. "Not a chance," I replied, gripping the shovel like it was Excalibur. The drones hovered closer, their glowing eyes scanning the area. Lyrian's fingers moved quickly over her scanner, emitting a pulse of energy that sent the nearest drone spiraling out of control. It crashed into a tree, its metallic frame crumpling with a satisfying crunch. "Nice shot," I said, raising the shovel like a cheerleader with a pom-pom. Her focus didn't waver. "The others are adapting." Sure enough, the remaining drones adjusted their trajectories, circling us like predators. One of them emitted a piercing whine, and I felt my knees buckle as the sound reverberated through my skull. "Lyrian!" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the noise. She didn't hesitate, sending another pulse of energy toward the second drone. It faltered, its movements becoming erratic before it crashed to the ground. The third drone, however, was faster. It darted upward, emitting a blinding flash of light that left spots dancing in my vision. "I'm guessing this is where the shovel comes in," I muttered, stumbling forward. Before I could swing, Lyrian unleashed a final pulse, and the drone exploded in midair, raining shards of metal onto the forest floor. For a moment, all was silent. "Well," I said, lowering the shovel, "that was exciting." Lyrian turned to me, her expression calm despite the chaos. "Your resilience is commendable." "Resilience? Nah, I'm just stubborn," I said with a grin. As evening fell, the forest seemed to exhale, the tension that had gripped it all day easing slightly. Lyrian and I worked together to gather the remains of the drones, her careful disassembly revealing components far beyond my comprehension. "These are not of my design," she said, holding up a small glowing core. "Wait," I said, frowning. "You're saying they're not from your ship?" She nodded. "Their technology is distinct, familiar, but not identical." "Great," I muttered, rubbing the back of my neck. "So now we've got mystery drones on top of everything else. Any chance we can catch a break?" Her lips quirked into that faint, almost smile. "Unlikely." Later that night, as we sat by the fire, I couldn't help but ask the question that had been nagging at me all day. "Lyrian," I said, staring into the flames, "what happens if we can't stop whoever's out there? What if they find us?" She was silent for a moment, her gaze steady. "Then we face them together." "Together, huh?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "That's a pretty big leap for someone who doesn't trust humans." Her expression softened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "Trust is earned," she said quietly, "and you have proven yourself." "Wow," I said, pretending to wipe a tear. "I'm touched." She tilted her head, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Your humor remains persistent." "Gotta stick with what I'm good at," I said, grinning. Despite the tension, the moment felt oddly comforting. For the first time since Lyrian had crash-landed in my life, I felt a sense of solidarity, a shared purpose that went beyond mere survival. As the fire crackled and the stars winked into view, I realized something else. For all the chaos and uncertainty, I didn't want her to leave. And judging by the way her gaze lingered on the horizon, I wasn't sure she wanted to leave either. The night was darker than usual, the kind of black that seemed to absorb sound and light. The mist had returned, wrapping the forest in a heavy shroud. I sat on the porch steps, staring into the void, the warmth of the coffee mug in my hands doing little to soothe the growing knot in my stomach. Inside the cabin, Lyrian worked silently at her transponder. She'd been at it for hours, her focus unrelenting. The fragments of the intercepted signal had shifted again, but now they carried something new. Coordinates. "You okay?" I asked, stepping into the room. She didn't look up. "I am fine." "You've been saying that a lot lately," I said, setting my mug on the table. But I'm starting to think you don't know what it means. Her lips curved ever so slightly, but the tension in her shoulders remained. I pulled up a chair beside her. So, what's the plan? We follow these coordinates and hope they lead us to the good guys? They are not my people, she said, her voice steady but low. I blinked. Wait, what? The technology embedded in the signal is not consistent with my species, she explained, finally meeting my gaze. Whoever sent this is something else. The next morning, we set out before dawn. The coordinates pointed to a location deep in the forest, far beyond where I'd ever ventured. As we moved through the trees, Lyrian carried her transponder like a compass, its soft pulses guiding our path. Any chance this is just a wild goose chase? I asked, breaking the silence. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. Do you often pursue wild geese? I chuckled. It's a figure of speech, means we might be wasting our time. Ah, she said, nodding thoughtfully. Then yes, there is a chance. Great, I muttered. Good to know we're risking our necks for a maybe. We reached the clearing just as the sun broke through the mist. In the center stood a massive, crystalline structure, its surface shimmering like water. The air around it seemed to vibrate, a low hum that set my teeth on edge. This is it? I asked, glancing at Lyrian. She nodded, her eyes scanning the structure. It is a conduit, a transmitter of sorts. For what? Communication, she said, stepping closer. Or perhaps transportation. I stared at her. Transportation? You're saying this thing could send you home? Possibly, she said, her voice calm but tinged with uncertainty. Before I could respond, the structure pulsed with light. A series of symbols appeared on its surface, shifting and glowing like a living code. What's it saying? I asked, my heart pounding. It is a query, she said, her brow furrowing. It asks for identification. Well, tell it who you are. She hesitated, her gaze flicking to me. If I do, it may trigger an irreversible response. Like what? Like sending me away, she said quietly. The moments that followed felt like an eternity. Lyrian stood before the structure, her fingers poised over her scanner. The symbols continued to shift, their light reflecting in her eyes. Finally, she turned to me. If this is my opportunity to return, I must take it. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. Yeah, of course, you should. She stepped closer, her expression softening. But I have learned something during my time here. What's that? That a home is not just a place, she said, her voice low. It is a connection. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I couldn't speak. And you? She asked, tilting her head. Have you not found something here? I laughed softly, shaking my head. You mean besides existential dread and killer drones? Her lips curved into a faint smile. You avoid the question. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Yeah, I guess I have. The structure pulsed again, brighter this time, and the symbols shifted into a new pattern. It is time, Lyrian said, stepping back toward the device. Wait, I said, grabbing her arm. If this thing sends you away, what happens to me? What happens to this? She looked at me, her gaze steady. You will endure, as you always have. Wow, I said, forcing a grin. Thanks for the vote of confidence. Her expression softened, and for a moment, I thought she might stay. Then the structure emitted a final, blinding flash of light. When it cleared, Lyrian was gone. The days that followed were quiet. Too quiet. I went about my routine, chopping wood, tending the cabin, trying to ignore the hollow ache in my chest. Then, one evening, as I sat on the porch staring at the stars, a familiar hum broke the silence. I turned, and there she was, standing at the edge of the clearing, her transponder in hand and a faint smile on her lips. "What took you so long?" I called, my voice catching. "I had unfinished business," she said, stepping closer. As she approached, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "Welcome home," I said, grinning. Her gaze softened, and for the first time, I saw her smile fully. "Yes," she said, "I believe I am." And in that moment, beneath the stars, I knew neither of us would ever be alone again.